Mute a couple.
That is the emergence of
Thank
the
you.
Australian-UK-US alliance, its impact on peace and the peace movement generally, certainly its impact on peace in the Pacific area, but also the options for diplomacy as a solution to the challenges that face us, and seeking to escalate, if you like, the peace imperative rather than the conflict imperative that seems to be so commonplace these days. We're delighted at Massachusetts Peace Action to have a panel of active participants, as well as everybody who is here to observe. And so a few of the ground rules are as follows. We'll have each of the speakers make a few comments for up to 8 minutes. And then after they completed that round, we'll then be more than happy to take questions. If you'd like to post or put anything in the chat, then please do. That may be helpful later on. The speakers, as you can see, Richard Tanter, Hannah Middleton, Lisa, Linda Nabadad, and Ting Wang. Two from Australia. I sound Australian, and I guess I still am. And Ting will sound Australian. But I live in Newton, in Massachusetts, in the United States, and I'm happy to say that Australia is the home of my birth and my culture. Let me start with a couple of comments about my own experience of the US and Australia, and then I'll hand over to Hannah. On the 23rd of October 1966, I stood on the tarmac at Kingsford Smith Airport in Brisbane as a member of the Brisbane Junior Eisteddfod Choir, and sang two songs as a member of that choir. One was Funiculi Funicular, Mario Lanza tune, and the other one was Auld Lang Syne. And the person for whom we were standing on that rather crusty old tarmac was none other than LBJ, doing the, if you like, soft power trip into the country as the Vietnam War ramped up. And sadly, as Australia joined in sending troops to that unnecessary and pointless conflagration that was really none of our business. I've had a lot of years to reflect on my participation in singing Auld Lang Syne to LBJ as part of a choir, and I suppose I've regretted it ever since. But in the meantime, it serves as an indicator of the long and, if you like, intense history of the association between Australia and the United States, and the connections, unfortunately, between Australia and the United States that have to do with violence and war. There are other connections, of course, but the ones we're here to talk about tonight are those that are the less and least pleasant. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Hannah Middleton and ask her to make her comments, and I'll give her a note at 7 minutes if she needs it. Thanks, Hannah.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody from Sydney, Australia. I start by acknowledging that I am speaking from the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and I acknowledge that this is Aboriginal land, always was, always will be. The Australia-US-UK alliance is currently expressed through the AUKUS military pact. And AUKUS will undermine Australia's sovereignty, threaten peace and stability in our region, destroy the economic well-being of this and future generations, and prop up the US and British arms corporations. On the ground, AUKUS means 1, US and British nuclear-powered and nuclear-armed, although we won't be told, submarines will soon be berthed near Perth in Western Australia. Second, the Australian government will pay billions of dollars to prop up US shipyards and to buy 3 second-hand US Virginia-class submarines, attack submarines, early next decade. Third, a new nuclear-powered attack submarine, the SSN AUKUS, will be built in collaboration with Britain. 5 of these submarines are due to be operational from the 2040s. AUKUS also includes cooperation on artificial intelligence, quantum computing, space warfare, underwater technologies, and more. Australian Defence Minister Miles is now claiming that the nuclear submarines are not for war, but to protect Australian merchant shipping. There are about 26,000 shipping movements to and from Australia each year, and there is no way a few submarines can protect them. We need to be clear that AUKUS is entirely about maintaining American hegemony in the Asia-Pacific region. AUKUS means that Australia, my country, is a country on the brink of war, not because we are threatened, but because the US wants this. Under the 2014 Force Posture Agreement with the United States, Australia is providing agreed locations and facilities to support US military operations against China. We don't know how many locations and facilities on our territory there are, but we do know that they are under US control and command and can be expanded at America's pleasure. President Obama launched the US so-called pivot to Asia to confront China, implementing the neocon policy of preemptive action to prevent any nation becoming a challenge to the US, using force if necessary. Anything goes, including truth, and allies like Australia must bear the costs for full spectrum dominance of land, sea, air, and space to protect US interests and investments. Just as Australia was led into the war on Iraq with lies about weapons of mass destruction, so now lies about an aggressive Beijing are being used to lead us into war with China. But the case is yet to be made that China poses any threat to Australia. The fact remains that the Chinese Army, Navy, and Air Force remain on or near its borders, while the US and its allies have encircled China with hundreds of military bases and missiles. At a cost of at least 368 billion Australian dollars. And these projects always have cost overruns, so we know it'll be many more billions. Australia will be sacrificing the health, education, housing, and other essential human needs of our people. With AUKUS, Australia is essentially paying the United States an exorbitant price to confront China, Australia's largest trading partner. A war with our trading partner would destroy our economy and cut off most of the exports and imports we require to function as an island nation. Hidden in the fine print of AUKUS is the deal that Australia will be responsible for storing high-level nuclear waste from the decommissioned reactors, despite the fact that we have no sight to store even low-level nuclear waste. Naval nuclear reactors pose serious risks for our people and the environment. Uranium is enriched to about 5% in French and Chinese submarines, but to 93% in Australia's vessels, greatly increasing the disposal problem. It also seems likely that the burial site will be in Central Australia, on land that is highly significant and sacred for the local Aboriginal communities. Australia's participation in a US war against China is not inevitable and is certainly not necessary. And Australians are beginning to realise that we must end AUKUS before it gets us all killed.
1 minute.
Despite the deluge of propaganda geared towards manufacturing consent for war on China, the Australian public is not confused of the need to rush into war alongside the US. 68% say Australia should only support US military action if it is authorized by the United Nations. And 76% believe Australia should develop a foreign policy that is independent of the global powers. Australian unions have repeated their opposition to nuclear power and nuclear waste. Former Prime Ministers Paul Keating and Malcolm Turnbull are leading a chorus of concerns about AUKUS. Our neighbours are unhappy. Indonesia and Malaysia are concerned about the proliferation risk. Former Secretary General of the Pacific Islands Forum, Dame Meg Taylor, says, "We in the Pacific have always wanted a place to live where there was no proliferation of nuclear weapons."
8 minutes.
I've nearly finished. In response to AUKUS, the peace movement in Australia is mobilising. But we need your solidarity in action. We need full spectrum resistance. We ask you all, individuals and organisations, to help develop a powerful international movement that can defeat AUKUS. Find out where the Australian, US and British embassies, consulates, tourist and trade centres are, and ring them, email them, visit them, picket them. Please make May the 1st and the 6th of August, Hiroshima Day, focal points for international action to smash AUKUS and replace it with diplomacy and peaceful coexistence. At a time when nuclear tensions have never been higher, we must make a united stand for peace and for the planet. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hannah. Much appreciated. And some great advice there, plus some excellent data. I will hand over to Richard Tanter, and Richard is going to put some slides up for us. There we go.
Just a minute.
That's probably not the one you wanted.
Probably not the one I wanted. Never mind. Come back where we are.
Here we are.
Could I ask for the frogs to be turned down just a tad? Well, we have our own here, and they're not quite so noisy. Okay.
Can you speak up, Richard? We can't hear you very well.
Okay. Me now, Joseph. Is this all right?
A little better.
Hang on, I'll disconnect. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Very good.
Thank you very much. Hi, Richard Tanter here from Nautilus Institute, and I'm speaking to you from Bunurong country, which is Indigenous land on the southeast coast of Australia near Naarm or Melbourne. As with Hannah, acknowledging this is Aboriginal land, always was and always will be. That's not just a matter of politeness, it actually is a really important factor in, frankly, the disasters of Australian foreign policy that we are now witnessing. I'm going to speak very briefly, starting my thing. There's a slide shot here which the organisers have, and I'll put in the chat in a moment. and it has some resources that may be useful. Let me start. Firstly, AUKUS is actually part of a much larger US refurbishing and reorganizing of its alliance structures. The old hub and spokes techniques, which have gone for almost 70 years, are shifting. Ignore the United Kingdom part. That's frankly absurd in the Australian context, with the exception, as Hannah rightly mentioned, of industrial subsidies to declining English shipbuilding facilities. The important part, Australia is now part of what I call global NATO under the heading of an enhanced strategic partner. This is something that has been shifting dramatically, and NATO has now declared Taiwan a matter of strategic interest to the North Atlantic. Secondly, the United States has organised a number of its second-tier partners, Australia, Japan, South Korea, France, of course, a major colonial power in our part of the world, and India, a semi-ally at the moment, to establish bilateral relationships with each other, which, of course, are all under US auspices. And that is very considerably strengthening the military capabilities of US-led allies in this part of the world. So I'll just mention that briefly, because I think that's really important for organising issues as well. Moving on, this is what James Acton from the Carnegie Institute, the way he's summarised the AUKUS plan, and Hannah's already spoken a little to this, and I just want to say a little more. Firstly, in brief, in 3 stages, US and United Kingdom to deploy US hunter-killer attack submarines, nuclear-powered, potentially nuclear-armed, with nothing to stop them entering Australia as such, from 2027. But we already have Virginia-class submarines visiting Australian waters. Just recently, there was one in Perth in Western Australia. That's viewed as a so-called stopgap, as our old conventionally powered submarines become more and more decrepit. Secondly, Australia will deploy Virginia-class submarines purchased from the United States, probably in about 9 to 10 years' time, and you can imagine the finances of that. Thirdly, Australia will deploy British-designed so-called AUKUS-class submarines, a class that has not even been designed, let alone produced yet, from the 2040s, most of them are arriving in the 2050s. That's an extraordinarily long time. As Hannah said, the cost at the moment has been put at 384 billion Australian dollars. It will, of course, be vastly more than that when the time comes. On the right-hand side, just mentioning a couple of things that Hannah mentioned. This extraordinary high-level nuclear waste storage facility, which is to be built. And I would remind you that there is no permanent high-level nuclear waste facility on an industrial scale anywhere on Earth at the present. There are a series of interim ones. The US gave up under Obama, the French have given up, the Russians have given up. This is a very serious matter for Australia because, of course, the plutonium in the spent fuel can then be extracted unless it is treated to make it irreversibly inaccessible. Naval training arrangements. We don't have anyone in our submarine fleet who knows anything about naval reactors. Naval and civilian engineering, regulatory regimes. We do not have an adequate regulatory regime to deal with any part of this, particularly harbour safety. The combat and communication systems will be entirely interoperable with those of the United States, and the fleet, such as it is, will be interoperable with the United States fleet. And of course, the industrial subsidies to the US and United Kingdom arms corporations. The most important thing to understand about these submarines derives from their characteristics of long range and long endurance. Usually the way you do submarines or such things is to work out what's the risk that you're trying to deal with, what's the strategic requirement. The only strategic requirement that leads to a need for long range, long endurance submarines is, of course, attacks on China, South China Sea, East China Sea in particular, assisting the US to blockade Shanghai, for example, or assisting in all-out attacks there. The characteristic of these submarines unarguably is not about the defence of Australia. It's about assisting the United States. And in particular, nuclear threat to China, which even if this should be stopped, will, and I'll speak about that in a moment, will not be forgotten in China. I mentioned stopped before, and I'll just go back to the previous slide here. That yellow submarine figure, if you click on it, links to an extremely good piece of work by Alan Beam and two of his former Australian Naval Submariner colleagues about what you need to design a submarine if you're doing it and how complex it is. The point being, it's not just $384 billion, which is a huge amount in Australian terms, absolutely huge, with huge impacts on the rest of the defence budget for anything that might be, putting it mildly, something more useful than what we're doing here. But there is a vast amount that can go wrong with those three stages that have been talked about there. This is certain to go wrong in certain respects, but unlikely to be stopped without huge political action. This is a gross and dangerous folly. It's massively expensive. The huge opportunity costs are really important. It most importantly makes it highly dependent on the United States. And our former Prime Minister, Conservative Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, argues strongly and rightly that it is a surrender of Australian strategic autonomy. And there are some references there that you can have a look at if you want to pursue this further. What's really important to understand about Australia is it is a host for US bases. None of them are US bases outright now. For more than 50 years, they've been nominally, at least nominally, joint facilities. We have a new category under which the AUKUS submarines will fit.
7 minutes.
Yep, thank you very much. Will fit. But I'll just draw your attention very quickly, for those of you who don't know Australia, I'm down here in the corner down here, and Sydney is up where Hannah is up there. Most of what's militarily important in Australia happens in the north, very underpopulated, and in the west there. What's really important to understand, the US Marines that have been deployed at Darwin, they're probably not militarily significant, but they will become so, particularly when they are merged with the US B-52s. About 6 of them planned to be on permanent rotation here at RAAF base Tyndall there. Alice Springs is here, and just outside is one of the largest US intelligence, well, probably I think the largest US intelligence facility outside the United States itself. Immensely important, A, for nuclear war planning and operations, secondly, for any military operations against China. This is extremely important. And I'll just give you a glimpse of the B-52s. That's the planning document that we have there. This is a hugely important thing for Australia because, of course, as far as China is concerned, is that when they see these coming over the radar, they have no way of knowing whether they are nuclear armed or not, and they could be. More importantly, under a loophole in the South Pacific Nuclear Weapon-Free Zone, to which Australia is a party, and it's a really important piece of work, there is a loophole put in at the Australian insistence, probably from American request, that does not ban, in other words, it permits temporary transit or visits with nuclear weapons. This is what's going to happen in Perth with the submarines. This is what's going to happen eventually in Tyndall. And we've been informed by the head of our Foreign Affairs Department that Australia will not seek to change the unbelievably humiliating US position of requiring alliance partners to us, like Australia, to accept its declaration. It neither confirms nor denies that we're
Okay,
on board.
that's 9 minutes.
Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you very, very much. Over to you.
Thank you, Richard. If you could remove the material from the screen. Thank you very much. Now it's our great pleasure to welcome Lisa, where are you? Lisa Navidad, and she's going to tell us where she is in the Pacific, speaking in the Pacific there, and we'll look forward to hearing what you have to say, Lisa.
Half a day, everyone. Good morning, at least in our time here in Guam. Guam is situated in the Micronesian region of the Pacific, more popularly known to the world as Guam. And so while most don't know that we're functionally a colony of the United States, We are most noted for being a military outpost in the Pacific, and our very strategic geographical location has put us in a very compromising position. The us that I speak of is our native people. We are called the Chamorros. We are the native population of our island who've been in our lands for over 4,000 years, whereas our colonial history and arrangement with the United States began after the Spanish-American War, and in which we were ceded to the United States through the Treaty of Paris. And so as a modern day American colony, it means a lot of things for us in terms of our status as US citizens. We hold US passports. However, we have no vote for the US president, and our congressional representative who we elect has no true vote in the Congress. We have very limited federal funding. One GAO report stated that we had about 1/7 the funding of that which is available to states, and we're excluded from different social service programs. And there are also a number of very restrictive federal territorial policies that are applied to us. And so being a US colony, which is primarily known for being a military base, on our island, the US Department of Defense occupies 1/3 of our landmass. And so there are a number of bases and different kinds of installations throughout. To the north, we're noted for Anderson Air Force Base, and to the south, we have Apra Harbor. And so the Department of Defense controls over 35,000 acres on an island that is 212 square miles. So we're a very tiny little island in the Pacific, and the military presence is very, very heavy-handed and continues to increase, particularly since its announcement. The governments of the United States and Japan entered into an accord in 2006, indicating the transfer of US Marines from Okinawa, Japan to our island. And that would represent a nearly 40% population increase to our island with that military presence and all of their adjoining accompanying personnel. And so this is our story, but I wanted to spend some time today to talk not just about Guahan, but about the Pacific in the context of AUKUS. And so sort of bringing the scope out a little bit, I wanted to share about our history in the Pacific of resisting militarization, which leads up to this work, leads up to our opinions and positions about AUKUS. And so in 1975, in the island or the country of Fiji, the Nuclear Free and Independent Pacific Movement was established. It's a non-government organization. They had a nonprofit leg to the organization called the Pacific Concerns Resource Center, and they held conferences between 1978, 1980, 1983. And through the NFIP process, they adopted a People's Charter for a nuclear-free and independent Pacific. Countries such as Belau, Vanuatu, and Solomon Islands, those three countries in particular, currently have nuclear-free constitutions. And so in this People's Charter for a Nuclear-Free and Independent Pacific, the preambular states, and I'll quote, "We note in particular the recent racist roots of the world's nuclear powers, and we call for an immediate end to the oppression, exploitation, and subordination of the indigenous people of the Pacific. We, the people of the Pacific, will assert ourselves and wrest control over the destiny of our nations and our environment from foreign powers, including the transnational corporations." In the Pacific, Micronesia in particular, Micronesia, the micro in Micronesia means small islands. And so we're very prime for exploitation by global superpowers, and the history has shown this and repeated this over and over. And so in another effort across Pacific countries was adopted in August of 1985, which was the South Pacific Nuclear Free Zone Treaty, also referred to as the Treaty of Rarotonga, which is the capital of the Cook Islands where it was adopted. And so the Pacific Island Forum adopted it at its 16th meeting in Rarotonga, which was in August of 85. And the treaty particularly stated that there would be no manufacturing or possession of nuclear weapons, no atomic testing, no radioactive waste or matter in the Pacific. The countries that were included in the list of support included, ironically enough, Australia, the Cook Islands, Fiji, Kiribati, New Zealand, Niue, Tuvalu, Western Samoa, Nauru, PNG, the Solomon Islands, Tonga, and Vanuatu. It's also important to note that to date, the United States has not ratified the treaty. And so another entity in the Pacific is the Pacific Islands Forum, which is a body of elected leaders and presidents of the different countries throughout the Pacific. And in their 2019 meeting, they established a mandate to carry out the provisions of the Treaty of Rarotonga. And in December, subsequently in December of 2022, they held the first state parties meeting to commemorate the 35th year anniversary of the adoption of the treaty. And as such, created a nuclear legacies task force to assist nuclear survivors in the Marshall Islands and in Kiribati. And so when we look at Micronesia in particular, which Guam is situated, and we talk about militarization, of course, the nuclear testing of the Marshall Islands is very much a critical piece in that story historically. And so the Pacific, in response to the announcement of AUKUS, has been resistant. There actually was a story that was written, I believe Nick McClellan had written it, getting and obtaining quotations from different Pacific Island leaders. And I'll share a handful of them. And so, for example, the Prime Minister at the time of the Solomon Islands said to the UN General Assembly, quote, "We would like to keep our region nuclear free and put the region's nuclear legacy behind us. We do not support any form of militarization in our region that could threaten regional and international peace and stability." Similarly, we have Prime Minister Bainimarama of Fiji, who also reported to the UNGA, quote, "The commitment of the Pacific Island nations to the elimination of nuclear weapons is not based on an abstraction. It is based on real experience with the consequences of nuclear fallout, and it is at the root of our sense of urgency." And so he reminds us, the Pacific really has been in so many ways the dumping ground. And so we also hear from the former Prime Minister of the Cook Islands, Henry Puna, who stated, quote, "Despite 36 years of the Treaty of Rarotonga, the 25 years since the permanent cessation of nuclear testing in our region, the nuclear threat remains, exacerbated by the permanent intergenerational consequences and impacts of nuclear weapons." And so collectively as a region, the Pacific has made its voice clear, has made its position clear of our effort, not just for freedom, but also for disarmament in the Pacific. And so AUKUS, of course, is a very tangible threat to this. It's ironic for me because as I was invited to this webinar and focused on the discussion herein, as a person who lives in the context of a very heavily militarized place where we have had threats from North Korea, we have a bomb in China called the Guam Killer, where the tensions around Taiwan now are overwhelming, that when we wrap our minds around it, it's really hard to breathe. The discussion of AUKUS is just yet another layer of our military reality that we have to contend with here. Something that is very unnatural for humanity, and we must always remember that. There's nothing natural about militarization for the human condition. And so as Pacific people, we're very rooted in our sense of self, in our connection with each other, and in our connection to land and the physical environment. And so for us, AUKUS is a violation of all of that. Unfortunately, in very recent news in the last few days, the incoming chair of the PIF, who's the Cook Islands Prime Minister Brown, was quote unquote assured by the US Secretary of State, Wendy Sherman, stating that AUKUS will not undermine or breach the Treaty of Rarotonga.
That's 9 minutes, Linda.
Thank you. Words as this really just don't mean anything to us, because we know from our own historical experience that, as Hannah shared in her opening, that this really is about global domination and hegemony of the United States. And so with that, I'll leave with that and just say that, Nick McClellan in a recent article called for Australia's need to call on the Biden administration and the US Senate to recognize and to ratify the Treaty of Rarotonga. And so I would just like to echo that from our Pacific perspective.
Thank you very much. And it is extremely important for us all to have the perspective of not only Micronesia, but the many, many people and countries scattered across the Pacific who are impacted, often without much opportunity to have any say in what's going on. And so Australia in some ways is the colonial power for the Pacific, and now the power ratio has been increased, as it were, and the scenarios certainly don't sound much like they're very positive, Lisa, certainly with those troops coming from Japan. All right, so let's move on to Ting, Ting from MAPA, and welcome Ting, and look forward to some comments from you.
Thank you, Marcus. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Ting, as Marcus said. I'm currently working at MAPA as a communication specialist. I recently last year moved to the Boston area and have been with the organization since January. And my background is Chinese Australian, so I'll be speaking from that perspective a little bit. It's interesting. It's always a little funny when I first moved here, people wouldn't know what to make of me because I look the way that I look, but when I open my mouth, I speak with an Australian accent. So people are a little bit bewildered. They're like, wait, but you're Asian, but you're Australian. So that's been a bit of like an interesting experience and a weird privilege that I guess I've experienced as well. But aside from that, being an Australian citizen definitely has its perks here. This is just kind of, I guess, a symptom of what has been spoken about previously about Australia's deeply embedded relationship with the US, a historical relationship. Australia, even from like a migration perspective, Australia is on the ESTA program. It's a visa waiver program. Tourists from Australia can come to the United States for 3 months at a time without any kind of visa requirement. A special line for us at the airport. I'm currently on a special working visa that's only available for Australian nationals. It's been pretty smooth sailing. But added to that, I'm an Australian citizen, but I also am like a second generation migrant. I was born in Melbourne, Australia in the 90s, and I've lived in Australia basically my entire life, mostly in Sydney. My parents were both Chinese immigrants to Australia in the 80s, and there are a lot of us in Australia. So for a bit of context, through the 70s and the 80s, there was a huge influx of skilled migration from Asia to Australia. And then in 1989, amid like a lot of political turmoil in China at the time, the Australian government allowed Chinese students to basically permanently reside in Australia. Australia has one of the largest immigrant populations in the world. In fact, immigrants, I think, account for about 30% of our population, and the Chinese-born population in Australia is at about 600,000. A lot of like huge community hubs, especially in major cities like Sydney and Melbourne. Lots of great food, though. Basically, I'm saying because of the immigrant population. I'm not saying that's only because of the immigrant population that there's great food, but I'm not saying that either. But that being said, the Chinese community is definitely not a monolith. And Chinese diaspora have all built their lives in different ways in the country and have, I'm sure, complicated feelings about how they relate to the government as well as their motherland, wrapped up in, what they've brought to this place that they call home now. So I think that it's important to understand all that in order to contextualize the Australian-Chinese relationship from both like a foreign policy standpoint and also from a racial lens. Australia is a settler colony surrounded by ocean. Our like Aboriginal Australians are still, still very much marginalized, experience a lot of intergenerational trauma, imprisoned at an alarmingly high rate compared to non-Indigenous people. We keep refugees who try to arrive by boat in an incredibly inhumane offshore detention centre, and also post 9/11, we've seen a lot of Islamophobia like throughout Australia. I would say that on Australia's relationship with war and how consent has been manufactured in Australia for war, Australia's relationship with its military, as in the Australian public's relationship with the military and with war, I would say is very different to the US. Lots of reasons that I can't go into, but for example, in a poll conducted just last month, only 20% of Australians considered China to be a threat, which was down from 6% in the previous month. We don't have the same kind of like military culture that I think is very much embedded in the US national identity. And therefore AUKUS has been a harder sell to the Australian public. That being said, it's not as hard as say the Ukraine war, even though there is a lot of obvious support from Australians for the Ukraine war against Russia. It does seem more like a world away. China is closer, it's current, and there's a lot more entanglement and room there to manufacture that consent. But as I think Hannah mentioned previously, this is something that's been in the works since Obama's 2011 pivot to Asia. Since then, we've seen a developing narrative about China for, you know, all sorts of things about China, about its government, about its president, about its culture, I guess. And I think that hits differently as well when you consider that, you know, there's a lot of our like international students, for example, are from China. So we have like a young migrant population as well. So like that comes into play culturally, I would say, like on a societal level. And for example, the report about like the persecution of Chinese Uyghurs in Xinjiang came from a think tank in Australia called the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. This think tank receives, sorry, I think that my
Oh, you're fine. We can hear you. Oh, you've gone. Lost your audio. No. No audio.
Can't hear you.
okay, what was the last thing that everyone heard?
Oh yeah, right.
Now we hear you.
Yep. Just before you stopped, you were going until you said you couldn't. You took your headphones off.
So that's okay. All right. Well, I will go now without my headphones. So I think what I was talking about was
ASPI.
ASPI.
How it's funded.
Yeah, so it receives funding from the US State Department as well as Boeing and Lockheed Martin. With COVID-19, we saw, you know, new facets of the story emerging and like tensions there. I'm not here to comment on like the validity of any of this or to have like a broader philosophical discussion about whether like Chinese government, good or bad. I'm more just highlighting how these pieces fit together to manufacture consent in a media landscape that's incredibly saturated. Since most of our media, I think all of our mainstream media is owned by two giants, either Murdoch or Nine Entertainment. And recently, big media masthead in Australia called Sydney Morning Herald released like a red alert series about going to war with China, ringing alarm bells about Australia's security interests and the need to protect ourselves with nuclear weapons, and also bring back mandatory conscription. It wasn't like outright saying this is what needs to happen, but it was floating in that idea, and that forms a piece of like the consent manufacturing.
That's 7.5 minutes.
So thanks, Marcus. So I guess where to from here? Obviously, war with China will have devastating impacts. As someone who is Chinese Australian, of course, I worry about anti-Asian racism in my community, the potential for this to fracture and divide Australians on that basis. There are also many other reasons to be concerned. I'm concerned about how this will impact the climate, the environment, how it will impact the Pacifica people in the regions if there is military conflict in that region. I'm concerned about the impact this will have on the Australian economy and society at large. I'm concerned about how this will impact Indigenous Australians living in remote areas of Australia, such as, you know, in like the 1950s, there was British nuclear testing in South Australia, which caused radiation poisoning in the local Indigenous population, illnesses, cancers, contaminating the land as well that they live and want to thrive on. And another part of this that does concern me, and that I think is maybe a little bit like of what's missing sometimes about this discourse, is about like, as someone who's Chinese Australian, there are people in China who are like my relatives who live there. There are like almost 2 billion Chinese people who are also human beings. And I think there's a part of this conversation that should be around, that should be a bit, it's personal, but it's also really macro. It's about imperialism, it's about US imperialism, it's about Australia's role in that as a sub-imperial power, which I think someone mentioned in the chat, that like as that sub-imperial power that has benefited from Western hegemony in the past, but also stands to benefit from a flourishing relationship with China. And I want to sort of keep all of this in mind as I look to Australia for its next move, and as I try to imagine an alternative and more peaceful future for everyone in the world. That's me.
Okay, thank you, Ting. Okay, now, yes, thank you very much. And thank you to all panelists. Much appreciated. A good range of views and experiences and perspectives. I'd like to offer the floor to the participants. If you would like to raise your hand in order to ask a question, please do make it a question rather than a statement so that we can get as many participants as possible. And also if you'd prefer to put something in the chat, then I can convey that question as well. But in the meantime, if anybody has a question, please comment. Oops. Okay. Let me just say that it is certainly worth keeping in mind the remarkable influence of a range of media interests that persist, as Ting just pointed out, in making both anti-Chinese and pro-US comments. And we live in an extremely mediated environment, in a mediated world, and enormous amounts of pressure on us. So thanks for raising that as an important aspect of the entire environment in which we're living. Okay, so I see Laura Gibney. Laura, please unmute yourself or press your space bar or something, and we look forward to hearing from you. You're muted still? See a lot of hand gestures, but no voice.
Yes. Oh, okay. Now it's
There
unmuted. Sorry, I wasn't able to unmute. Yes, I just wanted to ask you, with your two former prime ministers coming out and calling this whole scenario into question, are their voices making it through the mainstream media? Given that from what you've just said, Ting, you've got like two mainstream, you've got the two groups, the Murdochs and the other one. Are these prime ministers able to get their voices out? Are people hearing them and debating what they're saying?
Excellent question. Why don't we hear from the people who are resident in Australia first? But I'm going to take the chair's privilege and say, if everybody hasn't seen the recent performance, quote unquote performance, by the former Labor Prime Minister Paul Keating at the National Press Club, check that out, because he's a man who speaks directly and honestly, and from what used to be known as the cultural nationalist perspective. That is, there is a unique culture in Australia and it needs to be preserved. So I will hand over to Richard and or Hannah to make some comments and respond to Laura's question. Thanks, Laura.
Richard, do you want to go first? You're muted.
Look, Paul Keating's statements have broken through more than Turnbull's did. Turnbull was at first cautious, specifically talking about the submarines, nuclear technology controlled by the US, leading to strategic dependence, which is perfectly right. Keating went much further, and Keating has, it seems to me, actually moved away from old positions he's had, that cultural nationalism that was just mentioned, in a much more full-blooded way, and is now very sceptical of the alliance in ways that he was not before. So this is really important. Turnbull is important within, well, what's left of the Liberal Party and probably the Labor Party, but you need to bear in mind they are both fighting against this so-called bipartisan consensus between the two major political parties on foreign policy and defence. And it is very, very hard to break through that because, as Ting mentioned, the media control and then the related organisations through which US influence is exerted in Australia, like the think tanks and the academics, I'm afraid.
Yeah, you're right to be afraid. Hannah?
Look, I agree with what Richard said. That's enough. Let's go on to other questions.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Anne Wright.
Yes, Ann Wright from Honolulu, Hawaii, headquarters of the U.S. Pacific Command. My question is, with the Taliesin Sabre exercises beginning this summer, 20,000 or more military, has the military facility for housing jet fuel. We understand it was to be 60 million gallons of jet fuel for U.S. military was going to be built around the harbor of Darwin. And we hate that it's going to you, but we're glad to get that jet fuel out of Hawaii after it being leaked here. But can you give us an update on whether or not that's happening and the Talisman Sabre? Thank you.
Anybody have any update on that?
Well, Talisman Sabre is going ahead, and there will be more countries involved in the next iteration. I needn't go into that anymore. The fuel depot near Darwin it's my understanding, is actually being built and is near completion. Richard, do you agree with that?
Yes, it is. It is close to completion. It's very big. It's very close to Darwin City. And if there are any pollution events like you've had in Hawaii, it will be catastrophic. There is a smaller aviation fuel dump being built specifically for the United States, B-52s at Tyndall. These are really very big changes because you can work it out for yourselves, I think, why.
Yeah, thank you. Dan Shaw.
Yeah. My understanding is Australia has ratified the NPT. Just let me say this has been a really illuminating conversation, but get back to my point. The way I understood it is that US bombers will rotate in and out of Australia with nuclear weapons on board. Is that not a violation of the NPT? Or am I confused?
Could I answer that perhaps very quickly?
Of course.
I think the NPT isn't relevant. The NPT doesn't ban nuclear weapons doing pretty much anything except who can own them. I think probably what you're thinking of is the South Pacific Nuclear Weapon-Free Zone Treaty that Lisa outlined. And that has this appalling loophole in it which bans nuclear weapons anywhere in the zone and the territories of its countries, except for the matter of transits, which are very broadly interpreted. And we've now had a definitive official interpretation from the Foreign Affairs Department, which says the US could bring nuclear weapons into Australia under their policy of neither confirming nor denying. And this, of course, is both humiliating and needs to be addressed very carefully. So you're quite right, different treaty. So you got the answer.
Thanks, Dan. You want to say something else?
Yeah, my understanding of the NPT is that the signatories and ratifiers agree not to allow nuclear weapons or material that can be converted into a weapon on their territory or to do anything to transmit nuclear weapons or materials to other countries. So, unless I'm mistaken, that constitutes a significant violation of this treaty, which is very, very scary from my point of view.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. It's not only a matter of being scary. I think before we get to Annette as our last question, let me say that I don't think there's any reason, given all the evidence that we have from any number of sources and any number of conflicts, that whatever the US may decide to sign, it's going to actually follow or accept the legal requirements of the signature. It's a notoriously bad faith actor, I would say, in many actions to do with international politics. But that's me just sounding off on what amounts to paperwork that people in Washington don't seem to really care very much about. Annette, please.
Thanks, Marcus, and thanks for a terrific webinar with covering such a range of areas. I guess I've got a question for Ting. Really impressed with what you contributed, Ting, from an Australian Chinese perspective, and I look forward to talking to you outside of this meeting. My question would be as to how can we in the Australian peace movement work a bit more closely with the Chinese Australian community, because it is a very important part of the community in Australia. And I take on board, your your humanitarian approach to thinking about the ordinary people in China and what's at risk with a war starting up against China and the terrible loss of life. I also just wanted to mention that, you know, what Lisa had to say about the Pacific, and Lisa's very much a part of what is now the Pacific Peace Network, an initiative of the Independent and Peaceful Australia Network here in Australia. And we are organising a tour of Pacific peace leaders during the Talisman Sabre exercises to highlight the militarisation of Australia and the Pacific. And we will be having a conference in Brisbane on the 29th of July, and I'd love to extend the invitation to all of you at this meeting to consider coming to Australia to be part of that focus on peace in the Pacific. And I'm sorry, it's not really a question, just a plug.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. As a former, well, as a student from the University of Queensland many years ago, I can tell anybody who's here who's never been to Brisbane in July, it's a very good time to be in Brisbane. They call it winter, but it's really just like perfect. I think
Thank you, Annette.
I think our time is up. Can I, Ting, did you want to say something in response?
Oh, I was just going to quickly respond to what Annette said about, you know, connecting with Chinese Australian people. I'll make this very quick. Very good question, because it's a question that I've also asked myself. So I might not have the exact answers there, but I do definitely think that there's, when organising like progressive Australians or progressive like Asian Australians or people who are, you know, aware of things from like a racial justice lens, there is like a focus on like anti-Asian hate. So racism, I think, is something that would tie them together and people will, you know, really resonate with that as something that's worth like, you know, fighting against and campaigning for. But I think that there's still a gap to be filled. And I think those like tendrils are coming together with young people being more aware of like geopolitics. And I think that they are. And I think that will then have like a flow and effect as well with the broader Chinese Australian community.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Can I just say, by way, as we're winding up here, that MAPA is organising in 2 weeks' time Vijay Prasad, who's well known in many forums, and he will be presenting some comments and observations on this situation that we've been talking about today, as well as global politics, but particularly developing conditions in China itself. And secondly, MAPA is in the process of developing a US-China peace group or peace focus, and that's, as I said, in development. And if you'd like to either participate or know more about that, please reach out to Cole Harrison through the MAPA website, and we'd be delighted to add Peace Nix to the group and to our efforts in making peace. Are there any short statements that any of the participants would like to make as we conclude for the day?
That's terrific. Thank you very much to everyone.
Well, thank you to everyone. Thank you, Hannah. Thank you, Ting. Thank you, Richard. I know Lisa had another meeting to go to. Thank you to all the participants. It's been a wonderful opportunity to see some of you and to hear from you and to engage in this very important discussion and hopefully see, well, is it too much to hope for a peace breakout in the world? Thanks again, and I'll say good night, and until next time. Bye.